Welcome to What If Geography, the podcast. This is now part two of the our two-parter episode on the World Cup, and more specifically,
what if there was no World Cup? That's the question before us.
What if there was no World Cup? And I guess let's first do just high-level introductions in case you're listening to this. You haven't listened to the first part. Again, I always like to encourage you to go and listen to that first part, but I don't control you. You do you.
This can stand alone.
This can stand alone. So let's do some quick introductions. My name is Jeff Gibson. I am the host of the podcast of the same name, What If Geography. You can find that at youtube.com/whatifgeography. I am a geographer, city planner, just overall sort of nerd around this kind of stuff at large, as well as a soccer fan for a long time. And we didn't do pluggables in our last episode, which we kind of should have, but whatever. You're listening to this now, and that's the best part. But if you do want to find me outside of sort of what I do here and on YouTube, you can. It's I have a Substack newsletter. You can find it at geographybyjeff.substack.com. Whatever. Yeah, follow me there. Hunter?
My name is Hunter Shobe. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University, author of a couple cultural atlases. The first one, Portlandness, a cultural atlas. And then the second one, Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. So if you're interested in finding out about these cities and interesting ways to look at cities, please check those out. I've also published somewhat widely on soccer. Academically, I've done work on FC Barcelona in particular. And if you have access to academic articles, you'll find some that I wrote about that. Jeff and I co-authored a couple pieces about soccer, one of them dealing with soccer in the Pacific Northwest or Cascadia, and then another piece about the rivalry between the United States, for a book about the soccer rivalry between the United States and Mexico. And we spoke specifically about the competition for dual nationals there, hosting the Gold Cup, and then the idea of having a home stadium, because in Mexico they have the Azteca, which is this fantastic, huge, one of the largest soccer stadiums in the world. In the United States, we don't have a designated home stadium.
Yeah, I guess the closest you would get would be the Rose Bowl, which has historically hosted a lot of the big tournaments.
The final of the World Cup in '94.
Or in Columbus, Ohio, for some reason has become the de facto home of any sort of U.S.-Mexico games.
Right. The United States has had some historical victories there.
Yeah.
But anyways, those are some of my soccer-related credentials.
Yeah.
And happy to be doing part two now. We got carried away last time, and just there's so much to talk about, and we had to cut it short. But what we thought we'd do is give you a little bit of a recap here. So whether you're tuning into this one and didn't listen to the first or not, you'd be able to sort of follow along what's going on. I think the first thing that we want to repeat just a little bit is this tension between the term soccer and football in the first place, because in many places of the world, I'd say most of the world, the sport that we're talking about related to this World Cup that you play, the sport that you're kicking the ball and you're not allowed to use your hands unless you're the keeper, is called football. In the United States, in Canada, Australia, Ireland, and New Zealand, we call it soccer. And it was actually emerged, soccer was a nickname that was used for this sport in the UK, in England. I think in the 1880s based on our research is when that was used. It's a shortening of the term association soccer, which was the name given to the sport to make it clear and differentiated from rugby.
Right.
And that was a nickname I think that was used throughout time. And then at one point, it fell out of favor circa the 1980s in Britain, partially because it was being used, I think, in the United States. But we're going to use the term soccer because we are situated in the United States, and we may have people listening from lots of different places, but that's the term we're going to use.
Yeah, I think overall, people will recognize, and I don't want to conflate this with the power of the word, but I think people will recognize soccer as being wholly devoted to this sport. Whereas football, there's a number of countries, the United States included, but Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, maybe even South Africa, I'm not sure, but who we conflated the word football with various other things. And that's what we don't want to happen. So so we are from the United States, so broadly we use the term soccer, but we're going to use the word soccer generally more so than the word football for that reason, in that it is we're all speaking English here. So within the English speaking world, it is almost entirely devoted to that singular sport in a way that football just isn't.
Right. So we're trying to cast a wide net that way. Some of the things that we talked about in the first episode, this is happening. We're recording this during the
day
the
one.
World Cup, right?
Yeah,
Day one.
Sorry. I guess point of clarification, as you're listening to this, so you might have listened to the part one a week ago. We're now recording part two. Hunter and I are recording this all on the same day, which is day one of the World
That's right.
Cup.
So it's still day one, even though it's a week later. The point is that the 2022 World Cup is going on. There's been a lot of controversy around the World Cup and just around, there is in World Cups in general. So please refer back to the first episode, because we're not going to get back into that stuff too much, but we acknowledge that there's a lot of important things to say about that. And we touched upon that for context. So that's some of what went on in the first episode.
I think just broadly recognizing that Qatar has an interesting situation, to say the very least. And if you want to know more about sort of what we have talked our thoughts on the 2022 World Cup and the host of the 22 World Cup, to go back and listen to that first part. We don't want to. If we were to start recapping that, we would just get right back into it, and it'd be another 20 minutes.
Episode 3 or 4.
Then we'd need another whole part of this. So, but it's very interesting. So go, again, if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it, because there's a lot there. There's a lot to sort of chew on with respects to Qatar and sort of the World Cup as it's happening right now.
Other context that we established in that first episode was, how did this sport arrive in the first place? How did it develop? And there are many places in the world where a sport that you play mostly with your feet and kicking a ball around in different parts of your body other than your hand, this arose in many different places, right? So certainly in Britain and England, and this is where the rules come from that we observe today. But we can look in the Americas, we can look at the Mayan civilization, we can look at the Italic Peninsula where Italy is today, we can look at China, and we can find examples of somewhat similar sports being practiced there. So that it truly is, there's a global flavor to this kind of sport, even before we start talking about the World Cup, because although it wasn't identical from place to place, it occurred to people in different places of the world that this is a way to have a competition.
Right. So we talked about this a little bit last episode. I'm going to expand on it just a little bit more. So we talked a little bit about how the sport as a whole is so this word often gets conflated with negativity, but it's so basic in a certain way, right? It's a ball and two endpoints that it is in a certain way. It's just sort of natural that it would develop in multiple independent places without sort of interference or involvement from another country, right? So that's how China and the Mayan Peninsula get sports that are kind of similar, so that they feel similar, right? They look the same.
I mean, the idea that you would try to compete in a skilled way, controlling a ball where you didn't use your hands and you had to be innovative in different ways. I mean, this has arisen in different places. So that's a strong point that we made last time.
Yeah, and I think it just goes to show that even if so soccer, obviously, in terms of globalization, it's very well established for the vast majority of the world, right? But I think it goes to just show the getting back to the original point of just how basic the sport really can be, is like you can have you can have kids playing, what we would all identify as soccer, but be playing with very rudimentary equipment, if you can even call it that. Sometimes it's like literally a bunch of bags balled up into sort of with some sort of twine or something into a makeshift ball, and they're able to play this sport.
And that can be fun.
And it can be engaging, and more to that point, people can develop their skills based on that exact same sort of concept, right? In a way that other sports might not be as conducive to, right? There are some sort of inherent infrastructure that's required that's just not able to be built. And so just to really drive that point home, that folk football, as sort of we, termed it.
Which is a loose term for a number of sports that were that were practiced in pre-industrial Europe and pre-industrial England, which involved at times maybe handling the ball, at times tackling and different things, very different than the sport we know today. But, it was based on that idea that you didn't need a lot other than something that kind of looked like a ball. I think they used like an inflated pig's bladder or something like that. And that became an activity that would transpire over a day or two or something like that. We talked a lot about how when you have the rise of cities and you have the rise of industrialization, the rise of capitalism, folk traditions, they start to transform. And we can talk about this on any number of different elements of culture. However, we happen to be talking about soccer, and what used to be a very loose game that didn't have the trappings of pre-recorded, a set period of time or set boundaries or set demarcation between participants and observers, that all changed when we got into the city and we started to have rules and we started to have a work week and we started to have the kind of rationalization that was happening in the city. That concept of rationalizing through and regulation through time and space was also brought to sports, and it was brought to soccer as well, which was codified in 1863. And the rules were not completely like they are today, but the sport that we talk about as modern soccer really has its root in that moment of time in the 1800s.
Yeah, and sorry, one thing that I just thought about we didn't really talk about at all in the last episode, which is why these recaps are so important, because it jogs something loose that you're going to get a little bit of extra in here. It's worth pointing out that when England like sort of codified these rules, was also really at the height of the British Empire. And for those who might not be as familiar with the British Empire, there's that very famous saying, which is the sun never sets on the British Empire. And that was really historically true at one point, right? The
idea is they controlled so much territory that it was always daytime.
It was always daytime somewhere. And so I think it's worth pointing out that so the soccer that we know now, the association football that we know today, and that was codified by England, and sort of why and how England was able to, I guess, claim ownership of the sport, was also came at a time when they owned much of the world. I think there's actually a fun stat out there that I'm recalling from one of my YouTube episodes.
Controlled a lot of territory.
Yeah. But like, for lack of a better term, like they set a lot of So yeah, controlled is a hard word there,
right?
But for lack of a better word, they had influence on a large part of the world.
That's right.
And at one point, I believe they had a population of within the British Empire of over 2 billion people, which at that time was a lot of people, right? That 2 billion people today would be a lot of people. That'd be the biggest country in the world today. Back then, it would be even more.
Is that true?
I think so. I just did an episode on the British Empire.
Because I know that in 1830 there were 1 billion people on the planet.
Hold on. Maybe I'm.
So I'm not totally sure that.
Okay, I need to fact check.
We might have to go back and do.
All right.
We'll have to have an episode where we just fact check.
But regardless, yeah, that's true. Regardless, I think it goes to the point that they controlled a huge amount of people and were able to influence a lot of people at a time when the sport was being codified, and were able to then use that as a way to, as English people were going to, for example, South Africa, which has, historically been a place that they had a very heavy influence on, were able to bring those rules with them and sort of codify it in these different places, in India and Canada and like all these different areas in Africa that they controlled, right? So I think there's definitely a link there that we didn't hit on in the first episode.
What's interesting is that the places that that England and Great Britain controlled territorially are not the places where soccer has been the most popular. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at the United States, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and India, and soccer is not the top sport in any of those places. It's either rugby or it's cricket or the other sports that have developed, hockey or soccer, or, American football, baseball, and that it's the overseas mercantile empire of the UK that has spread. So to spread to places, like Argentina, for example, where soccer is enormously popular. That was not a colony of England, for example. So it's kind of a curious thing.
Yeah, you even look at Ireland, which has a very brutal history of English colonialism, and people like soccer there. I'm not taking anything away from, but if you look at it, Gaelic football is definitely Ireland's sport.
So in these places, other sports developed and nationalism coalesced around other sports in part to make it distinct from that colonial master of which, soccer was emerged as one of the most popular sports.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. We didn't talk about any of that.
We didn't talk about it, but I mean, that's fine. That's why we have this recap. That's why we can sort of dig in a little bit more, but let's keep going with the recap.
So the other thing we were talking about is that if we want to set up a situation where there's no World Cup, a World Cup necessarily is a soccer tournament that's organized by FIFA. And FIFA is the world governing body of soccer. And it was established in Paris in 1904. And so we started to set up the idea that there were some tournaments that were happening outside the auspices of FIFA beforehand. And if we're talking about this world of soccer, a lot of them involved English and soccer club teams in the late 1800s and the very early 1900s. And we started talking also about, once FIFA is established, the desire to establish a World Cup. And we talked a little bit about that on the men's side of things, and how 1930 in Uruguay was the first official FIFA sanctioned. If you're looking in the history books, where was the first World Cup? Well, it was in Uruguay, 1930. Uruguay was the winner, defeating Argentina. So we talked a bit about that. We talked about the fact that there are only 8. In the men's World Cup, there's only 8 different countries that have won the tournament so far, and we'll see what happens this year. And then we started talking about the Women's World Cup, because there's a distinct history that goes along with women's soccer and the Women's World Cup as well.
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth pointing out and just highlighting, because we're basically going to launch right back into this when we get into sort of the bulk of today's content.
Yes.
But it's worth highlighting that the Women's World Cup recently has grown in a lot of popularity, but it's had some starts that were stopped for reasons.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, first of all, that women's soccer, women's football, women's soccer has been popular for 100 years.
Yeah, it's been
longer, right? I mean, this is not a new thing. However, one of the reasons it seems new is because it was made very hard for women to participate and to use soccer grounds to play soccer in many countries. And the strongest example of this is in the UK, where women's soccer was very popular in the 1920s, until the Football Association there banned women's soccer on FA grounds. So if you're a club that belongs to the Football Association, which you have to belong to if you want to participate
if you're
formally
a professional
in the sport,
team or quote unquote professional team, right?
From 1921 to either 1969 or 1970. And it wasn't until 2008, we didn't mention this last time, that the FA decided they should apologize for that. So it took them another, 38 years, almost 40 years for them to say, yeah, that was bad.
Yeah, we screwed up. Yeah,
and so Germany and Brazil, which are 2 other huge soccer powers in the world, are also places where women's soccer was enormously popular, and also places where the authorities, the governing bodies of the national leagues, made it very difficult for these competitions to take place. And it wasn't that there weren't teams or there wasn't interest, but there was definitely an interest in curtailing that activity.
Yeah, there was an intentional desire to not have women's sport be seen as supplanting or being on an equivalent level as the men's sport.
That's right. And probably in some of these instances, it was more popular than some of the men's competitions. And that's probably what led to the need that somebody felt that we shouldn't let this go on anymore. And, we're starting to get in the what ifs.
Right. Well,
we're not getting into the what ifs yet. All right. So there's a lot more to say about the history of the Women's World Cup and women's soccer. And that's where we left off very excitedly, and we had to cut it short. But in 1970, there was a World Cup of sorts of soccer that was not sanctioned by FIFA, but by another organization called the Federation of Independent European Female Football. In Italy in 1970 and in Mexico in 1971, Denmark was the victor in both of those situations. And the final in Mexico was held in the Azteca Stadium in front of 110,000 people.
These are all very impressive. Before we actually get into all of this, we do have to run some quick ads.
Oh, is that okay?
Because
Is that what's
we
going
are
on?
already over our ad time.
All right. Well, let's get into that, and then we'll
But
pick this thread back up
if you,
again.
yeah, if you all can't tell, there's gonna be some juicy content coming here. I guess in the spirit of our Danish friends who won those first two tournaments, enjoy some hygge. Hygge, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but enjoy some hygge, which is a feeling of contentment, and listen to some ads, and we will be right back.
Excellent.
Welcome back, listeners. I don't know, ads, products, services. You listen to it.
We're back. We're talking about, we're leading up to talking about what if there's no World Cup, but we're talking about the earlier incarnations of tournaments that happened in women's soccer before FIFA sanctioned tournaments.
Because, and I think this is maybe something we already talked about, but maybe it's worth just reiterating that there's not just one World Cup, right? Oftentimes conflated, some people say the World Cup, and they'll imply that that's the men's World Cup. But what we're talking about is what if there was no World Cup in general, which includes men's and women. So which is why we are talking a lot about the Women's World Cup, because there's so much history there.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's a history that a lot of it's, I think, somewhat unknown. It's not as well known as some of the history of men's soccer.
Right.
We were talking about the 1970 and 1971 unofficial, well, they were official tournaments, but they weren't sanctioned by FIFA. And then there were a series of competitions that were sometimes referred to as Mundolitos. Mundolitos, which are little World Cups, like little world tournaments, right?
Yeah, because Mundo is world in
so the Mundial,
Spanish,
right,
Mundial.
would be the Spanish way of talking. You might talk about the World Cup. And so anyways, there was one in 1981, 84, 85, 86, and 88. And the final in 81 was between Italy and what was supposed to be between Italy and Denmark. And that wasn't played. I'm a little fuzzy on why that didn't happen. But the victor in 84 was Italy over West Germany. In 85, England defeated Italy. In 86, Italy defeated the United States. In 88, England defeated Italy. So what we're learning here is that there has been an enormous amount of tradition and expertise in soccer, not only in the United States for women's soccer, which sometimes, the United States has won 4 of the 8 FIFA tournaments, but we talked about Denmark, we're talking about Italy, we're talking about West Germany. We also mentioned, I think in the last episode, that the longest ongoing international tournament for women's soccer is the Asian Cup, the AFC Women's Asian Cup, which began in 1975. So there's a strong tradition there. There's also a tournament called the Algarve Cup, which is held in Portugal. That's been held since 1994. It's held every year, except 2021, which was a COVID thing. The final was supposed to, the final in 2020 was supposed to feature Germany and Italy. 2021, it wasn't held at all. But if we look at the winners of all of those tournaments of the Algarve Cup in Portugal since 1994, the United States won 10 of those. Norway won 5, Sweden won 5, Germany won 4, China won 2, and then Canada, Spain, and the Netherlands each won 1.
Which broadly, I think, tracks with, well, I don't know about China so much, but broadly tracks with sort of you would think of as a dominant women's.
The more contemporary era, let's say, since the 1990s. Right. If we look at a semi-professional soccer league, Japan established one in 1989. Back in the 1970s, Italy had a professional soccer league. And then in the United States, of course, we have a professional league today, but there was a professional league that emerged after the World Cup in the 1990s, I believe it was, and that ran for about
WPL or something.
Yeah, or was that after the United States hosted I think that was after the United States hosted the World Cup, and that ran for just a number of years, and before we had the resurrection with the current league that we have today.
I think there was 2 leagues actually. So I think prior to the current league that we have now, and maybe it was just a recent history. But I recall there being a stat out there somewhere that no women's league in the United States had lasted longer than 5 years, or had never made it to maybe year 5 or something.
So so in the United States, it was the WUSA, formed in 2000, ran through 2003. Yeah. It was the world's first fully professional women's soccer league, according to my notes. And the women's U.S. national team, incidentally, was established in 1985.
Okay.
And then the National Women's Soccer League, which we have today, was founded in 2012.
And that's now going on year 10.
That's right.
So they found some success. They found sort of how to get,
We would be remiss in not saying that the winner of 3 of those tournaments was the Portland Thorns.
the most recent winner as well for 2022.
That's right. So we're very proud to say that. If we're talking about FIFA getting into the Sponsorship Act and coordinating what is referred to as the World Cup because it's their tournament, there was a test run of something called the FIFA's Women's Invitational Tournament or Invitation Tournament in 1988. This was a contest that the finals featured Norway and Sweden, in which Norway won 1-0. And then in 1991, we find the first Women's World Cup. And this is not an Olympic year, and it is not a World Cup year in which the men are competing, so that they've staggered it this way to bring more attention, I suspect, to this particular competition. And so in that first competition in China in 91, the United States defeated Norway 2-1. In 95, it was held in Sweden. Norway defeated Germany 2-0. In 99, it was held in the United States, and the United States won that one in penalty kicks.
That was with, who was the player? Brandy
Chastain.
That's
Brandy
right. Chastain, yeah.
With the famous celebration.
Very famous celebration.
It's like, I can celebrate this way. Yeah. 2003, the United States hosted, I believe that was the year China was supposed to host the tournament, but there was an outbreak of SARS. And so it was brought to the United States. Germany defeated Sweden in overtime in that one. China then did go on to host in 2007, where Germany was again. So they were back-to-back victors. In 2011, Germany hosted, and the final featured Japan and the United States. And Japan won that tournament in penalty kicks 3-1. And then the last 2 were held in Canada and France in 2015 and 2019. The United States defeated Japan and Netherlands, respectively. And then in 2023, so the next World Cup is coming right up, next
year,
very soon. And that will be the first Women's World Cup that will be co-hosted, in this case, by Australia and New Zealand.
Which will be, well, one, it'll be a lot of fun. I think if you didn't catch sort of the trend there, especially towards the end, the U.S. team has been fairly dominant in recent history, although teams are catching up. But I think it's worth pointing out that that maybe one of the reasons why the U.S. has, since maybe like the 90s, has been able to become much more dominant in the women's game versus the men's game is because of a law that the U.S. passed in 1972. It's called Title IX.
This is legislation that mandated that there would be equal funds spent for women's sports than there would be for men's sports.
Exactly.
At the amateur level, I believe.
Basically, and how this trickled through was through college, right? Because so much of our sports in this country is through college sports,
and that's very different than other countries,
which is very different. But this enabled a level of training, a level of quality, a level of development within the United States for women's soccer that other countries simply weren't during that time weren't willing to or able to provide.
It wasn't a lack of interest; it was a lack of funding,
a lack of
political will.
But for some, it was a lack of interest, or an intentional lack of wanting to invest in it. Right? If we go back, we talk about England again,
investment.
Right? They're like, if people today are complaining about your country, especially if you're in Western Europe, your team not being as good as the United States, well, there's probably a historic reason for that, and that's not to say that the U.S. was altruistic and in having a good, solid women's team, but they were, at that period of time for thinking that, women need to have the same opportunities as men within college sports, and that enabled a certain level of investment and development in the sport here, and which is we're starting to see. We've seen that play out in how dominant the women's team has become.
This is part of a larger recognition in the 1970s in the United States that laws needed to be enacted in order to ensure that there were some equal opportunities provided to women, because lacking those laws, it wasn't going to happen.
Right. So that's, again, like the Women's World Cup, very fun, especially for us. We're based here in the United States. It's like I personally, I get really excited about both World Cups. For the men's World Cup, it's like, it's exciting, but if they make it out of the group, yay, that's the excitement I get out. But I'm not expecting the men to make it to the final. This time next year, or I should say summer next year, because it's not going to be this time next year.
We'll be expecting the United States to win.
I have high expectations, right? And it becomes a lot more fun for me. It becomes a lot more, I have a lot more invested in it, because I have higher expectations. So all that's to say is that I think there's and we've seen this play out through some key lawsuits here in the United States. Recently, I think there's definitely an argument to say that the women's team here is, in terms of sport, is more important than our men's team.
Yeah, it would be difficult to argue to the contrary.
I think it would be difficult to argue against that, right? It's certainly, if you're just going by trophies, the men's team is at in terms of World Cup, is at a big fat 0. And the women's team is at 4.
Half of them.
Fully half of them. So, I think the point that we're trying to make here is that the World Cup, certainly depending on where you're from, but the World Cup is not just the men's team, and there's a lot to be conflated with the men's World Cup, because that is where most of the marketing weight goes behind globally. But there's implications for both the women's and men's World Cup, certainly if they no longer existed.
Right. Well, I think the moment has come where we can entertain this question.
Let's do it.
This is the fun part, because we get to wildly speculate, right? And because it hasn't happened, we can kind of say whatever, and this becomes our opinion.
And then people get to argue against us and fight against us. And
that's fine, because it's all speculation. What if there was no World Cup? And we could really break this up into thinking about it in two different ways, and we can answer it both ways. On the one hand, what if the World Cup had never been held?
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, what if the World Cup stopped being held now? And we speculated that there's so much concern and consternation about the legitimacy ethically of holding some of these tournaments for various reasons, that maybe these tournaments shouldn't be held. But let's look more broadly at this idea that, what if there hadn't been a World Cup ever, and what would be different?
Right. So I think if we're going to talk about just no World Cup ever, I think this is now the time where we have to start talking about the Olympics again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the Olympics, outside of the World Cup, the Olympics are the other big nationalist sort of sport tournament. And granted, it's not just soccer. It's
right.
A lot of
many countries. Many sports have national championships, but none of them have the attention drawn to them. That's
the gravitas.
That's right.
Yeah. And if you didn't know, and honestly, it wouldn't be surprising me if you didn't really know, unless you were a hardcore Olympics or hardcore soccer fan. But if you didn't know, there is a soccer tournament that's played every year, or every Summer Olympics, or not every year, every 4 years. The Summer Olympics are, and this might honestly be by choice by one or the other, is an off year from the World Cup, right? So they're both 4-year tournaments. The World Cup is now 2022, which means the Summer Olympics will be in 2024.
Right. Now, I think remember that, you might not remember this, but I remember this, that the Winter and the Summer Olympics used to be held the same year.
Oh, I actually didn't know
that. That's true. Because I'm old enough to remember that. But they separated them in order to bring more attention. I'm thinking to the Winter Games, perhaps.
Right. Because they're a little, not to get us too off topic, I find the Winter Olympics to be a lot more fun, because the sports that attach to them are just things that I don't engage with very often, really only once every 4 years, like the skiing and shooting a rifle thing.
Right.
When else are you going to see that?
Right. I mean, if you're a Canadian listener, curling might be more familiar to you, but for many of our listeners in the United States and other places, this isn't something that we get an opportunity to see quite as often. Mm-hmm. But I think that the reason that the World Cup is staggered with the Olympics is because the Olympics predates the World Cup. And when FIFA started hosting these tournaments, they thought it would make more sense for both sporting reasons and for commercial reasons to have that off of what was then both the summer and the winter World Cup Olympics.
Right.
Now, I think one of the things that we can say that's different about the Olympics tournament today is that the Olympic tournament today, starting in 1992, is and this is on the men's game, because the first Olympic games with women's soccer didn't happen until 1996. So in 1992, the Olympics men's soccer made it an under 23 tournament. And this is something that I think FIFA mandated, and except that they could have 3 players that were over the age of 23.
Right. So essentially, I mean, so the soccer tournament as part of the Summer Olympics, I guess Summer Olympics is, it's very fun. It's very entertaining, but what you are watching is not what would be considered to be a full strength team,
national team,
right? It's very much focused on youth, and in a lot of ways it goes to, and I think the Olympics still sort of has this bent where it goes back towards, these are largely non-professional, right? Or at least early on, sort of,
that's been the
developing.
Certainly the spirit of the Olympics, the modern Olympics from 1896, when it was first modern Olympics held in Athens, is the idea that this was an opportunity for amateur athletes throughout the world to represent their countries and to compete. It was very much a moment of nationalism. It was started by a French man who wanted to promote nationalism in France and thought that this would be a good vehicle for doing that. That Olympics in 1896 didn't have, as I said, women. It's not until 1996, which is 100 years later. In 1896, there was no men's soccer tournament. And the men's soccer tournament was a demonstration sport in 1900 and 1904 when the Olympics was held in Paris and St. Louis. In 1908, the Summer Olympic Games was held in London, and soccer becomes an official competition. Recognized but involves amateur players. And the UK won, and I believe it was the UK. I have that in my notes. Because the United Kingdom is represented in the Olympics. And of course, there's 4 different football associations which compete in the World Cup. And so anyways, the UK team won in 1908, but it was represented by an English national amateur team. And what's significant about that particular Olympic Games is that it was the first official soccer tournament that involved what we now think of as a national team. And so, one of the big what ifs that we're talking about, what if there was no World Cup? Well, then the Olympics would have continued to be perhaps the primary way in which this sport, soccer, would have been the premier competition as it was at the beginning. So just to go a little bit more into the history, in 1912, the Olympic Games was held in Stockholm. Great Britain won the world gold again. And then in 1914, which is, the off year from the Olympics, there was a Olympic soccer tournament held and organized by FIFA, recognized as the World Amateur Championship. 1960, the Summer Olympics is awarded to Berlin, but it's canceled due to World War I. And then in the 1920, the Summer Olympics is held in Antwerp, Belgium, and it involved national teams, and that was won by Belgium that year. So the 1924 and 1928 Olympic tournaments were won by Uruguay. And Uruguay, I don't know if they still do this, sometimes if you are in the soccer world, you have a star over the crest of your national team insignia in order to indicate how many World Cups you've won. And Uruguay likes to recognize those as the equivalent of World Cup victories because they were seen as
before, and obviously they won in 1930, so that was not too far away. Right, it's probably the same players.
And I believe FIFA at this time, by the 1920s, is actually organizing the Olympic tournaments. I'm not exactly sure if I have the.
I mean, I guess that would make a little bit of sense, right?
Yeah.
If they're,
But now in 1932, the Summer Olympics dropped soccer from the games altogether due to a disagreement they were having between the IOC and the FIFA over what constituted an amateur player. So this tension between professionalism and amateurism comes in. So first thing, 1932, if there was no World Cup, well, there would have been a men's competition in 1932. 1936, soccer is reinstituted as part of the Olympics. And for me, FIFA promoted the World Cup as the premier world championship. So that again suggests that it would have been that if the FIFA hadn't been organizing its World Cups.
Right. Well, I think just to take it back, so we ran through a bunch of history, but I think the point here is to make that if the World Cup never existed, I think the Olympics would have slid in there as sort of the de facto. But I think if I'm thinking about the World Cup today, right? Obviously, I have now today a 2022 mindset. The World Cup has established itself so firmly within the sport that it is, if I were to ask any given, certainly Brazilian, Argentinian, but European, probably a lot of Asian and African countries, would you rather, have your, country win the most Olympic gold medals or the World Cup? I imagine a not insignificant amount of those people would say World Cup.
We'll take the World Cup.
Yeah. Right.
I think that's true.
It has become such a huge cultural qualifier. Now, I think if you ask, an American or maybe even a Canadian, some of these countries that aren't quite as bound to the sport as a lot of other countries are, I think they might still say Olympic gold medals, right? That's still, certainly in this country, winning the most amount of gold medals is definitely seen as a point of pride.
Absolutely.
But I think had the World Cup never existed, the de facto tournament would have been the Olympics, which then goes to say, would the sport have evolved to the amount of power and pedigree as it has today?
Or would it still have, for example, mostly amateur?
Or would it be mostly amateur, right? Because if you look at, gold medals across the Olympics, there's a lot of sports and there's a lot of gold medals, and really it's not really ever about a single sport. Now, some sports do take prominence, right? Certainly if we're looking at the US, swimming became a really big thing in the 2010s or maybe even the 00s, to the point where, people got, really proudful about certain swimmers. However, when we look at the Olympics as a whole and we're determining a level of success for a country, it's not about a specific sport. It's not about, well, the U.S. did really good in the basketball tournament, which basketball is part of the Summer Olympics. It's not about the swimmers, really. It's about, well, the U.S. earned 120 gold medals versus the next runner-up, which earned 110.
Well,
right?
And that's in the United States, where the United States is always a contender.
It's always a contender.
And so in countries where particular sports hold a lot of sway, there's probably a disproportionate amount of attention based on
that is
those
true. That's a good point.
sports.
Yeah.
So, for example, Spain, I think winning the basketball competition, for example, might be something that's held in high prestige. Or we could look at different sports. Certainly hockey in Canada and the Czech Republic would be an example of
which
that.
is a good point, right? I mean, if you do look at, let's go to the Winter Olympics for a second, even though that's not where soccer would take place. But, the hockey that's played inside the Winter Olympics does sort of serve as that comparison, right? In terms of, if we look at global soccer tournament, there might be a global soccer tournament, but what people really look at in terms of a team's or a country's dominance in that sport is, did they win it in the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, right? And so there's that very famous game played between the U.S. and the then Soviet Republic in 1988 or something.
1980, Lake Placid.
1980.
Right. And this was not the final, but the semifinal hockey match.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And where
Miracle on Ice, it's called in the United States. I'm not sure what they call it in Russia or in former Soviet republics.
Yeah. Where the U.S. won, they were considered the underdogs. They ended up winning it, and then that has become sort of a cultural moment.
That's right.
They went on and won, and
it was seen as a surrogate for the Cold War, basically.
Right.
And so this brings up a point that I think is really interesting: is that the Soviet Union was very dominant in many sports during the Cold War because they had a different definition of amateur athlete than many other parts of the rest of the world. And so, for example, in that hockey tournament, NHL players weren't allowed to compete in the hockey tournament. It was college players, but professional players in the Soviet Union, the equivalent of professional players, were competing there.
Yeah.
And so if we bring it back to the conversation of soccer, apparently the Soviet Union was a pretty strong power during much of the Cold War in the Olympic soccer tournament, because again, their athletes were more along the lines of professional athletes and amateur athletes.
Interesting.
So the politics and who would be known as soccer powers, if that was the premier soccer competition in the world, I mean, that things might be different in terms of who is winning those tournaments and who would be looked upon as a traditional power. So that tension between professionalism and amateurism would have been highlighted even more in the soccer world. And it's curious to think about how, if the Olympic is the premier international soccer tournament, how that would have been different.
Right. Because if you have different, for lack of a better word, standards of what, is professional versus amateur, and not everybody's playing at the same level, does that, I don't like to suggest, I'm not trying to suggest that sports have enough power to really dramatically reshape sort of the world. But I also think there's something there where it's a binding force where
it has an impact in the way that people understand places, and that has its bearing in the world of politics.
Right. So if
it's not the most important thing, but it has an impact.
If the Soviet Union, again, this is a big stretch, but whatever, I'm going to do it. This is the speculation part. If the Olympics is the premier sport, and the Soviet Union is able to sort of use these quasi-professional amateur sports in a way that other countries aren't, and they're able to dominate certain sports that have certain global impact reach, such as soccer does and did at the time, does that reshape whether there's a lot of forces that brought down the Soviet Union, but does that reshape at least some of the memories behind what the Soviet Union was? Does that reshape sort of the impact, the legacy that it's left? Does that reshape any sort of part of what the Soviet Union is if they were able to just be completely dominant?
Well,
right?
I mean, we kind of know because that happened in so many Olympic sports. And I think that fed narratives in the United States over what was fair.
Right.
Right. And the narrative coming from the United States, I think during that era was that that's not fair.
Right.
They're not playing fair. And that's a system that's not fair. That's a government that's not fair. That's a political system that's not fair. And then that sort of carries on from that. So I think that might have only been amplified had this been the case. Another thing though, and I'm going to raise this with you, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Right.
If we put aside the Olympics to the side for a moment, and think about the idea that, all right, so there's no World Cup, maybe there's no FIFA or something. Is there another tournament not associated with FIFA that might have developed and materialized and become the dominant force in hosting international soccer matches? And it's not the World Cup and it's not the Olympics, but it's something else. And that's something interesting to think about.
I definitely have some ideas. I'm going to leave this on a little bit of a cliffhanger, because we do have to go. We have to roll some ads.
Let's roll some ads.
We got to make some money.
I want to hear what you have to say about this.
All right. Come back in just I've got a couple minutes, 3 minutes. I don't know how long ads take, but come back. So we're back now. We left you a little bit of a cliffhanger. Hunter proposed a question.
So the question that I have for you is, let's say that there's no World Cup, is what we're talking about. And let's say that instead of the Olympics emerging as the premier venue for having international soccer tournaments, there was some other organization or some other tournament that started to develop as the premier soccer tournament internationally. Could that have happened? What would that look like maybe?
So I think I think it's probably highly likely. I think the way the sport has developed, there's a lot of money in it. And I think just as we've seen with basketball, for example, even though it's not as popular, there's been a nationalized sort of organizational or international organization that has sort of tried to form and coalesce around all of the money that is within the sport now. And in basketball, if you didn't know, listener, is very popular in the US, but is become very popular internationally as well. I don't know exactly what the rankings are, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was number 2 to soccer globally at this point, because it's grown heavily in Europe. It's grown heavily in China, for example, which is a huge market. And I think it's grown a lot in Africa as well.
No, I think that's a fair argument.
So I think that would naturally happen. I think where my mind initially went, though, was if you didn't know, there are right now existing at this moment organizations that are governing bodies of the sport of soccer that aren't FIFA. And obviously, Funner, you knew that.
Right. Yeah. So these are governing bodies actually for places that aren't recognized as countries either.
Right. And I think that so I think going back to the answer to that question, I think naturally some of these other organizations would have started popping up to recognize places in a way that the Olympics doesn't, because the Olympics doesn't recognize the same countries as FIFA does.
FIFA recognizes more countries than the United Nations does.
Right. And so for example, and I think the clearest example of this is that if we look at the Summer Olympics, there is a United Kingdom team. The United Kingdom is represented. They're the ones that get the gold medals. However, if you look at the World Cup today, right, there's an English team that represents England. There's a Wales team. There's a Scotland team that's not being represented in the World Cup, and there's a Northern Ireland team that's not being represented in the World Cup, but they are two independent teams that will play their own independent games to try and get to the World Cup, right?
That's right.
So that's one country, formalized sort of federal country that's broken up into,
4 different football associations.
4 different football associations. So I think there would naturally be another organization that would sort of spawn that would try and represent places and areas that aren't necessarily a direct comparison to what the Olympics is representing. So I think that would naturally happen. And today so just to go back to, so there's another organization I just really want to talk about because I think it's a cool organization, but it's called CONIFA, Confederation of Independent Football Associations, that sort of does recognize these places. And for one, Cascadia is represented. That's sort of where we're at. Oregon, Washington, British Columbia is represented there, rightfully or wrongfully. I think there's some other areas that rightfully have that, which would be like Kurdistan and there's Quebec that's represented. There's like a sort of group, a nation that's sort of up in like northern Sweden that's represented based on sort of their ethnic backgrounds. So I think something like that would sort of form. Absolutely.
So that's an interesting take on things, that there could be a different sort of political arrangement of a governing body that's starting to recognize places that aren't states. And certainly today, a place like Catalonia, which is not an independent country, which has tried to become an independent country just recently, one of their ideas is to be recognized by FIFA in order to gain legitimacy for their political movements. And so that wouldn't be a dynamic if there was no World Cup.
Which kind of goes back to, like, if we look at FIFA and the World Cup today, why does the UK, again, one country, right? They all have the same money. They all have the same sort of governing body. They do have their independent government, but it's largely, controlled by the Prime Minister. Why does the UK get 4 different football associations, but Spain, which, is...
They could have the Basque country.
They have Galicians. Yeah. You have Catalonians. That could easily be 4. Minimum, right?
I think the answer to the question is the power that the UK and the different, nationalities that make up the UK had when FIFA was first formed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. And England, again, largely likes to say that they, created the sport, founded the sport, but they also had a lot of the power still to this day, but even back then they had a lot of the power of that sport.
Every other country in the world has to modify their football association with an adjective. So it's the Brazilian Football Association, the Spanish Football Association, the Japanese Football Association. Yeah. And in England, it's just the Football Association.
Yeah, it's the FA.
It's the FA. Yeah. So that's this point of pride and nationalism that is distinct for the English with regards to the world of soccer as recognized by FIFA.
So then maybe it almost goes backwards. Had the Olympics not really taken up the mantle of the primary tournament, and FIFA never existed and the World Cup never existed, maybe some sort of tournament would have coalesced, later in the century, in which case we would have a British team, and
that's
we would have
possible,
a much more I guess back to your point, FIFA recognizes more countries or states or whatever nationalities than the UN. Maybe we would have fewer. Maybe there'd be less representation because it would just naturally go towards the predefined maybe UN countries or Olympic countries or something like that.
Well, since we're talking about the nationalism and national identity is related to the World Cup, and if the World Cup didn't exist, let me run this past you, and I'm interested in what your thoughts are. I think that if there was no World Cup, soccer would still be immensely popular in many parts of the world. However, in some parts of the world, soccer might not be as popular. And I'm wondering if one of those places is the United States. I think, you know, we talked about the Women's World Cup being one of the catalysts for the establishment of a professional women's league here. I think the popularity of the World Cup in the 60s and the 70s are part of what propelled the NASL, which was the first professional league, an early professional league in the United States men's soccer to happen. I mean, would there even be professional soccer at all, or would be as popular in the United States if there was no World Cup?
So I legitimately, I don't think so. And the reason why I say this is because, so if we go back in time to 1994, but let's say 1990, I think is when the U.S. was first awarded the 1994 World Cup. So
maybe even a few years before, but right around maybe before that,
right around the time. So if you didn't know this, you know, and obviously it was a long time ago, so a lot of you might not know this, but the U.S. did host the World Cup in 1994. It was. It
wasn't that long ago.
But I mean, at this point, right? Like there are now people who are listening to this who I
was
who
there.
were born after.
Yeah,
right?
that's true. Yep.
Because those people are adults now with, you know, jobs and stuff, which is kind of crazy to think, even from my perspective.
That's right.
But anyway, so if you go back in time, you know, the U.S. hosted in 1994, and to this day, that World Cup still stands as the highest attended World Cup in history.
Is that right?
It's still to this day, yeah. The most amount of people attended those matches. And I think that just goes to the infrastructure that we have here, right? We have a lot of stadiums that go over 100,000, whereas, you know, if you go to Germany or something, that's not that common.
Or close to that. Close to that number. We don't have a ton that go over to 100,000.
But they'll go up to like 80,000, 90,000, whereas I think like the average in like England would be like 40,000, 35,000. Okay. So, but one of the conditions upon the U.S. hosting the World Cup in 1994 was that they would establish a professional men's soccer league.
That's right. Yeah.
And so they hosted in 1994, and then in 1996 was the very first year that Major League Soccer occurred. So, and we won't get too deep into Major League Soccer as part of this podcast. Maybe that's a future episode where we talk more about sports and this country. But I do think that had the World Cup never existed, FIFA never existed, obviously the U.S. wouldn't have hosted in 1994, and therefore I'm not sure if MLS would have ever happened. The NASL maybe not have happened either, because again, like you had said, there was sort of a lot more people getting interested in the sport. Therefore, the NASL sort of becomes a thing based on the sort of popularity of the World Cup.
And I wonder if other countries might fall into this category as well. And I'm thinking specifically here of South Korea and Japan, who similarly, you know, hosted a World Cup, but had there not been a World Cup, you know, would soccer have reached the level of popularity that it has in those countries? I mean, maybe they'd still have professional leagues, maybe they wouldn't, but you know, those are other places in the world where soccer might not have as high a profile. And, you know, baseball, for example, I think was one of the most popular sports there, and may have continued to be, or maybe it still is, but, you know,
I think it still is.
It still is,
close,
I think.
right?
But,
I think it's gotten a lot closer.
Soccer's starting to rival that a little bit more. I think you're right. Baseball is still more popular, but the landscape of sport would be different. And many countries had if there was no World Cup.
Right. So I think it just goes to show that, you know, the World Cup, even though it's very national, it's a once every 4 years tournament, it has a lot of reverberating effects that I just don't know. So Major League Soccer here, again, not to go back to that, but just it's my most obvious and the example that I know the best, has had a rough time of establishing itself. And so not only was it able to get established by the 1994 World Cup, but it was also able to ride the waves every 4 years to increase its popularity, right? And so had the World Cup not existed, and this is probably going to be true for a lot of different countries, had the wave of popularity not existed, where people really, you know, even who aren't traditionally soccer fans, they sort of, you know, get interested in it through the World Cup. I got interested through soccer through the World Cup in 2002. Granted, I was pretty young at that point.
For me, it was 1990, but you know, I'm a little bit older than you are.
Yeah. But that's like, had those not existed, would I be interested in my own professional league today? And I don't know. I would say at the very least, any league that formed would be it would be much tougher to solidify itself. And I would say that's probably true for Japan and South Korea. It's probably true for a lot of different countries.
And I think that if we're looking at women's soccer, that one of these other tournaments, like the Algarve Cup or one of the previous incarnations of these tournaments that we talked about before, may have emerged as the de facto world championship for women's soccer.
Yeah.
And that would have also changed the level of interest in women's soccer in different places, and there would be a different geography to that as well. And so, in the United States, maybe women's soccer wouldn't be as popular either. And that in some other countries that might have continued to be really popular. And so we might be thinking about a different set of countries as the dominant powers in women's soccer had there been no World Cup as well.
Yeah. Or maybe even the inverse, right? So if the World Cup never exists, that means the men's World Cup doesn't exist, which also means the women's World Cup didn't exist. But we do have this Algarve Cup that, had some sort of prominence and some sort of established, tournament that promoted the sport. Could we see a scenario today where certainly in the US, right? So if we look at the U.S. men's national team and the U.S. women's national team, the U.S. women's national team, far more successful, had a lot more victories, is probably more popular. Collectively than the men's team. However, Major League Soccer, the men's league, is definitely still more profitable, more popular than the women's league.
Well, this has to do with the investment.
Well. But could we have seen no MLS? However, there was that tournament, the Algarve Cup, maybe that's still in Title IX, still promoting the women's game. Could we still see a women's league prop up and sort of become the dominant league in the United States? And maybe that happens again in other places as well, right?
That's a possibility, although the Algarve Cup might not have even existed.
It might not have even
existed if it weren't
existed.
for the World Cup. So it's a tricky thing. Although then, it took a long time for the Olympics to sponsor a women's tournament in soccer as well.
Yeah.
So here's another thing. Let's take this what if question in a different direction, which is, one of the things that we talked about in last episode was that Qatar had to build 6 stadiums for this tournament. They were mandated by FIFA to do that. We talked about how Brazil wanted to have 8 stadiums and FIFA wanted them to have 12. And so they had to, I think, create some new ones or they had to renovate some other ones.
South Africa very famously had to build a bunch of stadiums as
well.
Right.
And there's an enormous amount of displacement of people that went along with that as well. So if there's no World Cup, then there's fewer or what is sometimes called white elephants, which are stadiums that are built for the World Cup. And, there's the equivalent in the Olympics, but we're talking about the World Cup. And then they're not used anymore.
Right. Well,
and so that infrastructure wouldn't be there in terms of those stadiums, but what would that money have been spent on instead?
Right. Which I think, it's kind of like a black box question. You can put as much into it and like how much can you really get out of it, right? But I think to your point that, if we go back, when we talked about this in part 1, the expense of hosting one of these World Cups has varied. So obviously Qatar being the outlier of spending over $200 billion, but has varied anywhere from, I think it's, from 1998 to 2018 has varied anywhere from $2 billion up to, I think, like $8 billion, right? It's somewhere in that range. And that amount of money means something different depending on who the country is, right? So if you're looking at South Africa, they probably spent somewhere around $3 billion. That's a lot of money that would probably have a bigger impact that they could have spent on various services in Johannesburg or wherever, right? That they instead devoted to building these stadiums that since then have been used by their local league, but their local league didn't need stadiums that size.
Apparently one of the stadiums in Brazil is a parking lot now.
Yeah. Is that the one in Manaus?
That's not the one in Manaus, even, I don't think, or maybe it is. I think it's a
Yeah.
different one. The other thing that we mentioned last time that we should make sure to repeat here is that FIFA grants the rights to host a World Cup to a particular country, but they don't spend any money on infrastructure or stadiums or anything like that. So some of the statistics I have, in 2014, FIFA made $2.6 billion in profit.
Yeah.
In 2018, they made a reported $3.5 billion in profit. So $6.1 billion in revenue, over half of which was profit.
Right. And I think it goes to point to, I think where you're getting at is that FIFA doesn't make or do anything. They're a licensing organization.
They're a licensing organization, and that's
Marketing organization.
They're a marketing
Yeah.
organization, but they are not in the business of building things,
Right.
or their expenses deal with marketing and the prize money, which is much smaller than these numbers we're talking about.
FIFA does not host or put on the World Cup. It's a country, and more specifically, a sports authority within that country that is typically
given the rights to do that.
That's and they will, have their influence within the politics of the respective country to do whatever, right? But it is that country that is hosting and throwing these tournaments, and that's expensive.
Right, and there's been a lot of research done academically that suggests that hosting either the World Cup or the Olympics is a money loser.
Oh, it's a total money. Well,
And
I don't know.
there's a few-
I know the
there's
Olympics ones, but
there's a few exceptions to this.
Yeah.
But very few. I think that the 1984 Olympics held in Los Angeles is widely regarded as a pretty big moneymaker, but that's usually not the case. And I'll plug one professor, economist Andrew Zimbalist of Smith College, has been writing about this for a couple decades. And he's the third edition of one of his books called Circus Maximus, The Economic Gamble Behind Hosting the Olympics and the World Cup, is now in its third edition. And he's one of the scholars who's looked in great detail at the economics behind hosting these world events and suggesting that it doesn't really pan out for the taxpayer. I mean, there are people making money on this, but and there are some intangibles with, being able to attract a business and headquarters and tourists and this kind of thing to a place. But there's also a lot to suggest that, a lot of tourists would have come to a place and avoid a place because the Olympics, the World Cup are having there. So it's really a displacement of earnings in some ways. So anyways, if people are interested in learning about this, there are people out there writing about this, and a lot of them are suggesting that this doesn't really pan out that well.
Right. Well, and I think that goes to show that, using the U.S. as an example and Los Angeles as an example. So the U.S. in 1994, the reason why I started my statement earlier about from 1998 onwards is because the U.S. only spent around $500 million. And for the U.S. to spend $500 million it's nothing. It's
not that money couldn't be spent on other things, but
like broadly, it's like, I mean, it really is.
This is a country, the United States, that's in debt every year, but
True. But I think it goes to show that, a country that is, that has already built up the infrastructure through other things, oftentimes not rightly, but a lot of stadiums, will inherently have more to gain from hosting one of these tournaments than a country that, doesn't have the infrastructure. So going back to 1990 or 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, a very large city, had a lot of infrastructure, didn't need to necessarily build a bunch of new stadiums. They have the Rose Bowl, which still exists today. It was built a long time ago, which seats 90,000 plus people.
Yeah,
right?
Close to 100,000.
Close to 100,000.
The World Cup in 94 had over 100,000.
Right.
In fact, I went to a semifinal match of the World Cup in 1994 between Brazil and Sweden, and it was me and my friend and some 100,000 other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it just goes to, like, there's a lot more to gain for a country like the U.S. that doesn't need to spend as much. But for a country like Brazil that maybe needs to,
we'll see
or
how
is
much
forced
the
to
United
spend.
States spends in 4 years. And so that number is going to be a lot more than $500,000. And there will be a lot of critiques about the money that's spent there that could be going to other things.
That's true.
When in 4 years, we do this podcast about what's happening in the United States, Mexico, and Canada, we can revisit that. So one more question maybe before we sort of wrap it up, I think. And that is, and we've been talking about, what if the World Cup had never been held? But what if the Cups just stopped being held? What if there was enough critique, there was enough.
We packed it in. We were done.
Yeah,
We're just,
this is
good enough.
FIFA is not an organization we should be supporting, perhaps, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And, let's not have this anymore.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the clearest answer is that the U.S., Canada, and Mexico would not be hosting in 2026.
Right. Or maybe that's the last one. But, that's a harder thing to, maybe some of these still things just sort of move up. So does the Olympics then all of a sudden become more prestigious in the soccer world? Is there another organization that crops up? But another thing is that it may have been a sea change in the way that people see sport and what is legitimate to spend money on.
So I think if it stopped today, I don't think the Olympics would necessarily pick up the banner. What I think would happen... Of course,
that could also go away.
It could also go away. What I think would happen is, in a similar way to how Europe has dominated the club sport, I think we would see the Euro Cup, which is the tournament hosted just for European countries. It's run by UEFA, which is their continental governing body. I think we would see that sort of pick up the mantle as being the creme de la creme of soccer tournaments
for the men's and the women's.
For the men's and the women's both, yeah. Because, and if you didn't know this, so let's go back and do a little bit of sort of introductory stuff that maybe we should have covered already. But the world is broken up, and we've talked a lot about the Asian Confederation, but the world is broken up basically by continent, right? So there's the Asian Confederation, there's the European Confederation, UEFA, there's the African Confederation, there's South America Confederation, there's North American Federation, then there's Oceania, which is a little different and a little interesting because
Australia has subsequently defected to the Asian one.
Yeah. So
to make it easier to make the World Cup,
right.
Actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's some geopolitics almost there at play. But each one of these has their own tournaments, right? So here in North America, we have the Gold Cup. The Gold Cup is a North American tournament. So it's, Mexico, US, Canada, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, all these different countries here.
Honduras,
right.
Central American countries.
Not to leave anybody out, but just to this is basically for every country north of Colombia. We all play inside our 26, 28 nation country tournament. And the winner wins the Gold Cup. And it's always been hosted by the U.S., and that's a whole other topic of why that is. However, these tournaments vary in popularity. There's really, if we're looking at global popularity, the Euro Cup, which is the European competition, is far and away the most popular, followed maybe at least semi-closely by the Copa... Libertadores, yes, which is the South American tournament, right? So, I think the Euro would absolutely become the dominant cup. I think it would become the dominant tournament, and what most people around the world would start following, just like most people would follow their, Paris Saint-Germain, their Manchester United, their Manchester City, their Liverpool, their, Bayern Munich, that kind of thing. Rather than, and maybe, South American teams would continue following their Copa Libertadores, but I'm not sure if any of the other continents would have any sort of meaningful tournament.
Yeah, no, I think that those would be much higher profile, I think, ultimately.
I'm not sure if the Gold Cup would be able to continue to survive.
Right.
Well, is that it?
I think that we've covered a lot of ground there, and it'd be interesting to talk about other aspects of sport or other aspects of culture in future podcasts. But I think for now, we've done a pretty good job.
Yeah. So when you're watching this episode, it will be day 12 or something like that.
Right. So it'll still be the first group stage.
Group stage. Yeah. Yep. So we won't necessarily know, or we might just be ending. We might know a few groups at this point.
Yep.
Have concluded. But hopefully, wherever you're listening from, I wish your team good luck in the tournament. Again, this is day one for Hunter and I. And let's run through some pluggables because we totally forgot to do that last time. So
Well, I'm Hunter Shobe, and a couple of books that I've written might be interested for people interested in geography to check out. They're cultural atlases. Portlandness, a cultural atlas, and also Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. Co-authored both of those by David Banas. So if you're interested in these kinds of interesting things, maybe check those out.
Yeah, and well, my name's Jeff. You can find me at my YouTube channel. That's just youtube.com/whatifgeography. Same basic concepts, shorter episodes, more graphics, obviously. And then you can also find me at my Substack newsletter. That's geographybyjeff.substack.com. And again, just to clarify, Geoff, Geoff is how you spell my name. So don't go to Geography by Jeff because that's not where I'm at. I'm no longer on Twitter for the obvious reasons that Twitter is a dumpster fire at this point. So we will see you next time, where I think we'll have some fun episodes about fish and the global fisheries. So,
all right.
Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.